On Halloween night, as darkness falls, terrifying stories come to life. In the shadows, cursed spirits, eerie forests, and haunted castles reveal their dreadful secrets. Be cautious, for in each tale a woman holding a severed head is waiting for you. When I was a child, visits to my grandparents' house on Sycamore Street were a regular part of our lives, especially around the holidays. Their cozy, old-fashioned home was a place of warmth and safety except for the house next door. That house belonged to Agatha Crowley, a woman who haunted our nightmares. Agatha was a towering figure, over 6 feet tall, with a face as cold and hard as stone. She wore a tattered black dress, heavy work boots caked with dirt, and an unsettling, rusted logging chain around her neck. Her wild, gray hair-framed eyes that burned with an unsettling, feverish intensity. No one saw her outside except when she was obsessively scrubbing the exterior of her house or tending to her garden in the dead of night. And when she did, she muttered to herself, her words an incoherent mix of curses and threats, warning that the devil was coming for us all. One Halloween, when the wind howled through the trees and the moon cast ghostly shadows on the ground, my cousin Mark dared us to do the unthinkable, ring Agatha's doorbell. Terrified but unwilling to back down, we crept up to her porch. The doorbell echoed ominously, and suddenly we heard violent crashes and bangs from inside. The door creaked open, and there she stood, her face twisted into a terrifying grin. In her hands, she held a severed head, blood still dripping from its neck. We screamed and ran, our hearts pounding as if they would burst from our chests. When we told the adults, they dismissed it as a Halloween prank, a prop meant to scare us. But the image of that head haunted us, gnawing at our minds, a dark seed of terror that grew with each passing day. A month later, that seed sprouted into a full-blown nightmare. Aunt Beth was unloading groceries from her car, her young son in her arms, when Agatha attacked. She appeared out of nowhere, silent as a shadow, wielding a rope saw. Without warning, she looped it over Aunt Beth's head and began to saw, the thin wire biting into her flesh. Aunt Beth's screams pierced the air as she struggled, her son crying in terror. She kicked at the door, trying desperately to escape. My Uncle James, hearing the commotion, burst out of the house with a fire poker. He didn't hesitate, he swung it with all his might, connecting with Agatha's skull with a sickening thud. She crumpled to the ground, her eyes still wide with madness, blood seeping from the wound. But the true horror was yet to be discovered. The police arrived, and as they investigated Agatha's home, they unearthed it from beyond our darkest fears. Beneath her house, she had carved out a labyrinth of tunnels, twisting and turning beneath our feet. In these tunnels, they found a nightmarish shrine, surrounded by rotting severed heads, their empty eyes staring into the void. The walls were smeared with strange symbols, painted in blood. Agatha had been preparing for something that involved us. Aunt Beth survived, but the rope saw left a deep, jagged scar across her neck, a permanent reminder of the horror she narrowly escaped. She and Uncle James couldn't bear to stay. They moved far away, leaving the memory of that night behind. Agatha's house remained abandoned, its windows dark, a decaying shell of the terror that once lived within. As for me, I grew up and moved on, but the memories never left. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the faint clinking of chains dragging across the floor, the echo of Agatha Crowley's twisted laughter seeping into my dreams. And I know, deep down, that some nightmares never truly end. In a small village deep in the forests of Michigan, Halloween was always the most anticipated event of the year. Each Halloween, the village would come alive, filled with spooky images, glowing jack-o'-lanterns, and eerie sounds echoing in the night. But hidden behind this beauty were dark legends of wandering souls and nameless ghosts lurking in the deep forest. In 2014, Liana Cruz, a young and beautiful girl with a love for the supernatural, decided to attend the biggest Halloween party she had ever heard of. Liana's bright eyes sparkled with excitement as she entered the party, held in a deserted field by the forest, attracting hundreds of people from far and wide. The music blared loudly, flames flickered in the dark, and laughter mingled with the atmosphere. Liana laughed loudly, dancing in the crowd, feeling her heart beat strongly in rhythm with the excitement of those around her. But as the night wore on, a sense of unease began to creep into her mind. Amidst the noisy and wild atmosphere, Liana suddenly felt something was wrong. She noticed a cold gaze watching her from afar, an unearthly look unlike anyone else in the crowd. She turned her head, but saw nothing but shadows blending into the misty night. The unease grew in her heart, but Liana decided not to let it interrupt her fun. She told herself it was just an illusion created by the mystical atmosphere of Halloween. But the worry didn't go away. After a while, as the music and crowd became too overwhelming, Liana decided to leave the party to find some peace. She walked out of the field and into the forest, where the light from the party gradually faded, leaving her alone in the darkness. Liana felt the cool forest air, the dampness of the earth and trees filling her nose, as if she were being drawn by a strange force irresistible. The deeper she went into the forest, the further the sounds of the party receded, giving way to the natural sounds of the night forest. The rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant hoot of an owl, and the gentle crunch of her own footsteps on the dry leaves. But then, these sounds also began to turn eerie. Liana felt something was watching her, an invisible presence hiding in the darkness. She stopped, looking around. Everything became unnervingly quiet. Suddenly, the lantern in her hand went out, plunging everything into darkness. Liana felt her heart pounding, panic rising within her. She tried to relight the lantern, but the flame kept being snuffed out as if by an unseen hand. The darkness became oppressive, heavy, as if it wanted to swallow her whole. In a moment of panic, Liana heard a strange sound behind her. It was the dry snap of a breaking branch in the night. She turned around but saw nothing but darkness. Fear spread through her body. Liana stepped back, trying to stay calm, but her legs felt frozen in place. "Is anyone there?" she called out loudly, but only the echo of her own voice answered, cold and hollow. Liana started walking faster, trying to find her way out of the forest, but everything seemed to change. The path she thought she had walked became unfamiliar. The trees seemed to grow thicker, blocking her way. Cold sweat broke out on her forehead. Liana felt as if she was trapped in an endless nightmare. Suddenly, a hoarse laugh echoed from afar. The laugh was cold, dry, like the laugh of someone who had lost their soul. Liana turned and ran frantically, full of fear, but the laughter followed her, getting closer. She didn't know how long she had been running, only that the darkness around her was growing thicker, and the laugh seemed to weave through every tree, every root, closing in on her. At that moment she tripped. Liana fell to the ground, in pain and despair. She scrambled to her feet, but her legs wouldn't respond. The fear had paralyzed her senses. In the moment she looked up, a shadow appeared right in front of her. It was a tall, gaunt man, his face hollow with white eyes like those of the dead. "Welcome home," the hoarse voice echoed, cold as the winter wind. It was Darnell, a madman living in the forest, who had been forgotten because he had disappeared many years ago. His eyes gleamed with madness, as if his joy was only satisfied by seeing the terror in Liana's eyes. She struggled, but her strength was fading. Darnell dragged Liana deep into the forest, where he had long prepared a dark ritual, a ritual to summon lost souls, to steal the life force of others to extend his ghostly existence, only leaving behind an uncertain darkness and the helplessness of the young girl. The next day, as the sunlight filtered through the forest canopy, Liana's friends and family began searching for her. Footprints led them deep into the forest, where no one dared to venture after sunset. Finally, they found a tattered green leaf dress, covered in mud and bloodstains, abandoned on the cold ground. Liana had vanished as if she had never existed, leaving only a painful void in the hearts of those who loved her. But that night, those who passed by the forest heard the wind whispering a strange voice. Halloween was no longer a joyful night, but a night of fear, where darkness consumed everything, and no one knew who would be the next to get lost in the forest and never return. In the remote, fog-shrouded hills of Silerwood, a young woman named Elora found herself accepting a peculiar job offer. She was to house-sit for the mysterious Winthrop family, caretakers of a grand but decaying mansion that had stood abandoned for decades. The manor was the stuff of local legends, whispers of dark secrets, curses, and malevolent spirits surrounded it. Ilara was no stranger to odd jobs, but something about this one unnerved her. The house, with its Gothic spires and cracked stained glass windows, seemed to watch her as she approached. The air was thick with an unsettling energy, making her hair stand on end. Despite her unease, she reminded herself that the pay was good, and the job was only for one night. As she settled into the cavernous living room, Ilara noticed the odd arrangement of old portraits on the walls. Each painting depicted members of the Winthrop family, their expressions growing progressively more sinister as she moved her gaze from left to right. One portrait in particular caught her eye, an ancient depiction of a woman with eyes so lifelike they seemed to follow her every move. The night grew darker, and the manor creaked and groaned as if alive. Ilara tried to ignore the noises, chalking them up to the house's age, but the unease gnawed at her. She decided to pass the time by reading, but every time she looked up from her book, she had the creeping feeling that something was out of place, like the shadows were moving on their own. Around midnight, the phone rang. Startled, Ilara picked it up. A cold, disembodied voice whispered, "Have you checked the cellar?" She shivered, telling herself it was just a prank, but when the call came again, the voice was more insistent. "Why haven't you checked the cellar?" Unnerved, Ilara finally decided to investigate. She descended the narrow, spiraling staircase that led to the cellar, the air growing colder with each step. When she reached the bottom, she found a heavy, iron door. As she touched the door, it creaked open on its own, revealing a pitch-black chamber. The light from her phone barely pierced the darkness, but it was enough to see that the walls were lined with strange, ancient runes. In the center of the room stood an old wooden chest, its lid slightly ajar. Trembling, Ilara approached the chest and opened it. Inside, she found a small, intricately carved doll, an eerie replica of herself. As she picked it up, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the runes on the walls began to glow with a ghostly blue light. The phone rang again, echoing through the chamber. Ilara answered with a trembling hand. The voice was no longer disembodied. It was her own. "You should have never come here, Ilara," it said, full of malice. Suddenly, the walls started to close in, and the shadows coalesced into the form of the woman from the portrait, her eyes burning with a malevolent light. Ilara screamed and fled up the stairs, but the house seemed to warp and twist, corridors elongating, doors vanishing. The manor was alive, and it was hungry. Ilara finally reached the front door, but just as she was about to escape, she felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. She spun around to see the woman from the cellar standing before her, her face twisted in a nightmarish grin. "You're mine now," the woman hissed. Ilara's scream echoed through the empty hills of Silerwood, but no one was around to hear it. The next morning, the Winthrops returned to find the manor eerily silent. The only trace of Ilara was the doll, now resting in the center of the living room, its eyes wide with terror. The Winthrops placed the doll alongside the others in the cellar, a collection that had grown over the centuries. The house would wait, as it always did, for the next unfortunate soul to stumble into its clutches. And so Silerwood Manor continued to stand, a sentinel of dark secrets and forgotten lives, its malevolent heart ever hungry for new victims.